What is up, Sleep Tribe? Welcome to a brand new episode of the Healthy Sleep Revolution podcast. I am your host, Dr. Magna Dasani, and our guest today is Dr. Karin Johnson. Did I say that right?
You got it.
Awesome. Perfect. So we connected over social media as always. And Dr. Johnson is a professor of neurology at UMass in Springfield, Massachusetts. And she brings to light a very, very important point, which when I was talking to her before we hit record, I said, I don't think we've had anybody that has really gone in depth into the topic we're going to dive into. So before we get into our little chat, welcome, Dr. Johnson. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thanks for having me.
As we dive into our topic today, let me ask how or what got you interested into permanent standard time and all of its effects, for lack of a better word, on our sleep? How did you get so involved and into all of this?
So this actually goes back to 2020, and I'm involved with the American Academy of Neurology in our sleep section. And so we were asked by the American Academy of Sleep Medicine, who just put out a position statement endorsing permanent standard time, to have the AAN support it. And we said, this is a great idea. The science looks like, there's reasons for doing this. And AAN was hesitant because they really didn't know about how big the effects are, what would it do to kind of everything across the board. And so they wanted to learn more. And I was really finding there to be a gap. Doctors really only wanted to talk about the health, but people weren't endorsing it because they're like, well, we don't know about economy. We don't know about safety. We don't know about, energy. And so they didn't kind of want to make a stance for those reasons. And there was a big gap there. And so I educated myself and kind of got pulled into learning more and delving into the topic. We did successfully since convinced the American Academy of Neurology, as well as the American Medical Association, American Thoracic Society, and others have all now endorsed permanent standard time as we have gotten out this information out there to people.
That's amazing. Way to take charge. It's like, I am going to do this. We need more of us to do this. For our listeners, can we backpedal just a little bit? And if you wouldn't mind going into what is the difference? Like, what is standard time versus permanent? Is that daylight savings time, right? Am I getting this correct?
Yep. So let me take you briefly back to the 1800s. So we have time zones primarily because of the railroads. Before then, people would just look up, they'd see the sun overhead at noon, and they would call that noon. But what that does is you go across a time zone, people would be 4 minutes apart, 10 minutes apart, and, trains would be crashing and people would be missing their trains. So as we brought our world together, we really needed a standard time. And so that's when they came up with time zones. And the original standard times had the midpoint of the time zone, the meridian of the time zone, with the sun overhead at noon. And ideally, everywhere within the time zone would be within a half hour of that. So on the eastern end, the sun would be overhead at 11:30. On the western end, it would be at 12:30. Now, because of economic interest, we have certain parts of the country that are really in the wrong time zone. So Indiana, Michigan, when you get to those ends of the time zones, their sun is only already overhead on standard time closer to 1 p.m. So now we have this then daylight savings time, which shifts the clock by a whole nother hour. So where the sun was overhead at noon, now it's overhead at 1. If it was already overhead at 1, it would now be at 2. So essentially, we're trying to shift the amount of daylight, which is fixed and changed, and we can't change the sun, but move it more towards the evening clock hour. And the problem is our body really stay aligned to the sun being overhead at noon, so we see this discrepancy. And anyone who's a parent knows if you tell a teenager go to bed, their body is saying, I'm not ready. But so they have a harder time falling asleep. And then in the morning, now you've shifted compared to your sort of natural time when your body wants to wake up. Your work and school time's an hour earlier. So now you're getting them up before they're ready, tired, grumpy, not fully thinking, and they've lost sleep, and more likely to have what we call social jet lag, which is sleeping, way in on weekends to try to make up for that sleep loss. And it is worse in teenagers, but this affects all of us, and especially anyone who has to get up, whether it's for work or for caregiving or whatever it is, before 8 a.m. in the morning. We basically are taking away the opportunity to get the adequate and aligned aligned sleep that we need to really optimize our health, our safety, our cognition, our brain function. And so that's what we're really fighting to bring back, is to get more aligned with the sun.
Right. No, I agree. No, when you think about it, they're like, it's only an hour. No, it's an entire hour. And I know it takes me, close to a week to attempt to get my body into learning to wake up when it actually needs to, based on what the clock tells me. And I have 2 teenagers, so I'm completely on board with what you're talking about. Now, I know there are differences, right, between the short-term effects of what occurs immediately when we have the time change, the clock changing, and the long-term effects of living on either of those 2 times, the daylight savings time versus standard time. Would you go into what those look like, short-term and long-term?
Yeah, the short-term, we have the 2 switches. So in the spring, at least in the Northern Hemisphere, we are moving from the more aligned standard time to the more misaligned daylight savings time. We also are springing forward, so we're losing that hour of sleep. So we kind of don't have as much time to get in sleep, and we're not getting our bodies help to get us, in sync. And if anything, we're now in this sort of perpetual out of sync state. And so we really see the harms of the clock change after the spring. So studies have shown increased risks of, kids doing worse at school, people missing their appointments, heart attacks, strokes, car accidents. These things tend to really, occur, especially like the Monday after the clock change. The weekend's not so bad because you're kind of trying to sleep in or things, but when you then suddenly have to get up against that early social schedule, that's when we start seeing the issues. And some effects, really can, be seen, for several weeks out. Usually by 2 weeks, most of sort of those acute changes and disruptions are gone. For some people, they feel a disruption in the fall. It's a little harder because we're going into shorter days, and that often, makes people feel worse just because the days are getting shorter and darker, but we don't in general see as much of those increased risks. Now, what people don't realize though, is we don't fully get back to baseline after 2 weeks. So if we look at studies that have either been able to compare people who are living on permanent daylight savings time to people living on standard time, we see things like increased depression when people are in those years on daylight savings time that are lowest when we're on permanent standard time, and kind of in the middle if we're doing that clock change. We have other studies that have been able to look at places within a time zone that are on the sort of eastern edge or more aligned with the time where the sun is overhead at noon, to the western edge where they're already kind of that hour off. And we find that just having a later clock time, later sunrises and sunsets, is associated with higher risks of cancer, of obesity, of heart disease, diabetes. And one thing that a lot of people think, isn't the case is that, if it's later, it'd be safer for driving, so we'd have less accidents. There's a study showing about 20% more car accidents when you're over a half hour late from the sun being overhead at noon. And so, the brain effects, the alertness effects that we get from the sleep disruption and the circadian disruption outweigh the sort of benefits we might get from, having light at certain times a day. So the brain is really important. And if we can keep it healthy with good sleep, we really can do better in sort of all areas of life.
Yeah, for sure. Because, we worry about all this in our patients that do have sleep apnea, that do have sleep disordered breathing. They are naturally just dealing, it sounds like a lose-lose for these patients, right? Because they're already dealing with having to, their body going through everything it is because of the oxygen deficits. And now we throw in, let's try to give you this one more thing to deal with. So this certainly, I'm sure it impacts what we see. And I agree with what you said about the seeing more number of accidents. I know in our practice, we have more patients like miss appointments that Monday after. We're like, let's make sure we have an admin day scheduled because we know that people are going to be missing it.
Yeah, and we get a lot of just I see sleep patients, and so I get a lot, and they come to me and they're like, oh, I'm really suffering, and they'll come, a month after, 2 months after, and be like, I'm still feeling it. I just do not feel, where I was when we were in that more aligned state. So it really lingers with people. If you have an underlying sleep disorder, you're gonna already be at risk. Unfortunately, we have a sleep deprivation sort of pandemic across the country.
Yes.
Over half of Americans don't get the sleep they need. So, if you add losing, so one study estimates that if you have about an hour later sunrise and sunset, the average adult worker loses about 20 minutes of sleep. Now, if you have to get up by 7 a.m., you lose about 36 minutes of sleep. Now, this may not sound like much, but this is on top of already being sleep deprived. And we see it all the time in our patients. So if I can just get them, to sleep a half hour more, they'll feel, even if it's still insufficient, they'll feel so much better. So these incremental amounts, are a lot. Another public health policy is later school start times, and they've been showed just by moving school by a half hour, an hour later, to get kids about that much extra sleep, people do better in school. They have less likely of car accidents. They are more likely to show up to school, have less depression, have less obesity. So we know that public policies can just make it easier for us to do this. Everyone's like, oh, you got to lose weight, you got to do this, let's just make a public policy that makes it all easier, where we don't have to do anything other than live our lives and let our circadian rhythms really help us, fall asleep on time and get up on time, and not, need those alarm clocks, forcing those early awakes. And that's what we can really do with a public policy like permanent time.
I completely agree. And I was just thinking about it, that growing up, I know, and there's still a lot of, like, for example, my grandparents' generation would be like, oh, sleep is so overrated. We'll sleep when we're dead, or all of that. So I'm so excited to see this shift happening towards where we're actually prioritizing sleep. Like I mentioned, I have 2 teenage girls, and I deal with very grumpy teenagers when this time change happens, and I have to remind myself they need the sleep. And then you give them the car keys and put them behind the car to drive themselves to school. It worries me. So yes, I'm glad that there's people like you that are helping get this.
And as you mentioned that, so there's 2 ways to end time change. There's permanent daylight savings time, permanent standard time. So we've tried permanent daylight savings time twice before in the US. Both times it was very unsuccessful. And it really does, affect, again, those kids the most. And so we would have sunrises after 8 a.m. for between 2 to 4 months, depending on where you are in the US. It's usually for a longer period if you're down south. Which a lot of people, always think of up north being darker. But and so those dark sunsets, were associated with more kids getting killed at their bus stops, more morning accidents. So you are putting these sleepier teenagers out on the road, and other people out on the road now in the dark. Plus in the winter, now you're getting ice and other things that are affecting the roads more. So it really does affect that safety, again, not only from the darkness in the morning, but because now you're really affecting that brain function, so much more. There's a study of students that I think is really powerful. So it's by Gasky, and he looked at Indiana, who used to have a lot of the state on standard time, but the edges were on daylight savings time seasonally, not even the permanent, but even the seasonal daylight savings time. And they looked at SAT scores, and they found that on average, the SAT scores in the parts that did daylight savings time were about 16 points lower, but it was even much lower if they were lower income. They were about like 23 points. It was 49 points lower if they were lowest income, 23 points lower if they're mid-income, and 8 points lower if they were the highest income. So everyone was worse, but we really do affect these disparities. We're talking about these people who are already at risk, for not good sleep. Those are the people that kind of get tipped over to really having it affect, their lives.
Yeah, it sounds like those effects are much more far-reaching than we can even begin to comprehend. How can we help ourselves, our families, our patients, our children adapt to this, what are your tips or tricks that you usually discuss with your patients to be able to get our bodies used to all of this?
Yeah, I mean, it's really, as you said, people thinking about sleep and prioritizing sleep and changing that messaging around sleep, that it's not cool to, to be sleep deprived. It's great that we're having sports figures and other people, really saying how important sleep is. I think that's great messaging for people. So, having people really recognize that if they're getting a lot of light at night, if they're missing light in the morning, that's going to shift their schedules, make it harder. So we have to turn off those electronics at night. We got to reduce that light exposure at night that are shifting our schedules even further, and really, do that wind down routine so we can get to sleep with enough time before, we have to get up. So you gotta, if an average adult needs 7 to 8 hours and you have to get up at 6 a.m., you need to be going to bed and be able to fall asleep, around 10 if you want any hope of sort of getting that adequate sleep. So you kind of got to do that math, decide what you need to do as a person, depending on your schedule of how can you get that. And our teenagers, they more need 9 hours of sleep. So, what teenagers are going to bed at 9 o'clock at night, it's really hard for them, but we do a lot of things, electronic light, activities that make it even harder. Whereas if we can look at sort of what we're, we can help that. Now, right around the shift, we can do things for the week before and start kind of gradually, sort of moving towards, the time to, again, looking at things like our light exposure, really help us get there quicker. But ultimately, it's all about, trying to get on those schedules, give enough time to get that good quality sleep. And then if you're trying and it's just not happening, really look for sleep disorders. Sleep apnea is super common. So especially if you have trouble staying asleep, and, or waking up and feeling unrefreshed, you might have sleep apnea, especially younger kids and things might have narcolepsy or other reasons. So, there are sleep disorders that do need to get addressed more than just not giving enough time to sleep as well.
Yeah. Do you ever bring melatonin into the picture at this point? We've had guests on the podcast and I've seen both sides of the argument of the coin as to how people think about it. What are your thoughts on melatonin and its use, especially at this time of year when we're trying to make this shift?
Yeah, I mean, obviously there is issues with melatonin overuse and people especially using high doses, and the issues that, because these are sort of over the counter, you never know what's in them, and you got to make sure you're not giving something that also has marijuana and 5 other things, in it as well. But the main way I do like to use melatonin is for people that have an issue with their timing, their circadian rhythm. So I'll give people like a 0.5 milligram of melatonin about 12 hours before their desired wake up time. So if you're about to go into the shift and you now need to be, getting up earlier, if you take that small, low dose of melatonin, it will help shift your schedule earlier, make it more likely that you can fall asleep on time and wake up on time. The issue with the higher doses is when we take melatonin or have melatonin in our body in the morning, it actually pulls and shifts our schedule the opposite way. So it can make it harder to get up, and the next day you'll be even more shifted. So if you take like a 10 milligram amount, that's going to still be in your body in the morning, pulling you the wrong way. So you actually get more of that favorable sort of circadian benefit of moving your schedule earlier if you take that very small dose early.
Yeah, this is very valuable for those that are listening. I hope you've really dialed into this point, because as a professional, as a specialist who deals with this, Dr. Johnson mentions the 0.5 milligrams versus over-the-counter doses of like 3 and 5 and 10 milligrams. And people seem to think the more I take, the better I'm going to sleep. No, it actually pulls you in the opposite direction. I think this is a very valuable point that you made, and that people really need to make sure they're dialing in, working with your doctors to make sure you're working, getting the right dose, and not just because it's a gummy, take as much as you can because it tastes good. So I think that was a very valuable, right? Very valuable point there. So, Dr. Johnson, as we start to wind up, where can our listeners find you? Where can they get more information about everything that you're doing and everything that you have to share? Is there a website? Is there social media? Please share all of that.
So we really need people to act both at the state level and the federal level, asking their legislators and saying, we support permanent standard time. We really encourage you to go to savestandardtime.com or ditchdst.com. Both of those sites have a lot of information as well as very easy ways to reach out to your legislator. You click a link, put in your zip code, and it'll get a letter for you to reach out. Save Standard Time especially has a lot of resources. It tells you what legislation is going on, a lot of the information and studies that are around this. So, and if you want to help, if you sign up at those sites, then when activity is coming in your state, will give you a heads up about we really need someone right now talking to their legislators and pushing for a bill. So we'd love to get more people involved with this. I think we can get it done. We're seeing this shift with less support of the permanent daylight savings time. As we are educating people, we're seeing more bills for permanent standard time, but we really need the general public out there saying, this is what we want, this is what we need, this is how we can successfully end time change, and not repeat the mistakes of history and try to push for the permanent daylight savings time. That not only gets us in a more misaligned state and is associated with with more issues, but we just know it didn't work in the past and don't expect it to work. And a lot of the the reasons why it was tried in the past to try to increase save energy, those really aren't holding up in more recent studies. So we actually use more heating and cooling when the sun is out later. And so those energy costs are going up, and with the with a world getting warmer and more people with air conditionings, that and light getting cheaper, the balance just isn't there to save on those things. So a lot of the potential benefits of daylight savings time just aren't there. There are some businesses that get some more business in the afternoons when the sun is out later, but if you think about the economy as a whole, we need workers that show up to work and are healthy and are functioning. And, so the majority of people that are going to their jobs and, and are going to do better, be more productive, maybe can get out a little earlier, enjoy the same amount of sun. We're not changing the amount of sun in the day, but we're getting it more aligned with the sun so that we can kind of naturally just really optimize, our health, our function, how we can enjoy the day.
Yeah, for sure. And for those that are listening, we will have these websites listed in the show notes, so you don't have to go hunting for it. Make sure you, go read everything, click on the links like Dr. Johnson mentioned. And before I forget to ask you again, what are your social media links for people to find you at?
So I'm at Dr. Sleepy Karin, Karin, and Save Standard is another great site, and at DitchDST is another way to find us. So lots of ways to find us. And another thing that is a resource on the Save Standard Time website is a set of short videos on different topics. They're about 5 minutes each in length. So if you want to learn about the effects on energy, on students, on health, we have little short videos that really gets more into the data behind all.
Oh, that would be a very valuable resource. I know I will be clicking on there as soon as we get off this call. But I want to thank you for taking the time to come on. This has been fascinating. As much as we think we know about daylight savings time versus standard time versus this versus that, I think this was very valuable information, super eye-opening. Go watch the videos, get the resources that Dr. Johnson has available. And as I mentioned, we'll post all of her links in the show notes. Thank you so much. I truly appreciate everything that you're doing and for taking the time to come on the show and educate our listeners.
Thanks so much for letting me highlight this topic. Appreciate it.
All right, guys, make sure you share this episode with your friends that need to listen to this. Leave us a review, and I will see you next time.